Okay, we're doing some graphing of sine and cosine graphs. Let's see how this looks. So we'll start off with our amplitude, period length, vertical shift, horizontal shift of this thing right here. Amplitude is the number in front, so it's 1. Period length, we always start off with 2 pi, and then you multiply by the reciprocal, whatever's in front of my x. I'm going to multiply by 1/4. When I simplify, I'm going to get 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. There's nothing added on the end, so there's no vertical shift. There's nothing added with my x, so there's no horizontal shift. My period length is pi over 2. So I made my line and my 4 hash marks. I'm going to label the fourth one as pi over 2. This is half of that. So half of pi over 2 is pi over 4. This is half of that. Half of pi over 4 is pi over 8. 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8, which is a half. Once I've done that, I'm doing amplitude. My amplitude is 1, so I go up 1 and down 1 to -1. That's the top. That's the bottom. My midline is still in the middle. I'm graphing cosine, so cosine starts at the top. So I'm going to put my first dot right there. Middle, bottom, middle, top. Connect the dots. There's number 1. Number 2, I'm going to zoom in to see this better. Number 2. Y equals 5 cosine 2 pi x. Amplitude is the number in front. It's 5. Period length, you start off with 2 pi, then you multiply by the reciprocal of whatever's in front of my x. I'm going to multiply by 2 pi. That cancels, leaving you just 1. So when I make my graph, that line right there is 1. This is half of that. This is half of that. 1/4, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, which is 1. Vertical shift would be what's ever tagged on the end. There isn't one. Horizontal shift is whatever added with the x. There isn't one. So my amplitude is 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Up to +5. That's the top of my graph. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Down to -5. That's the bottom of my graph. It's, again, a cosine graph. So since it's a cosine graph, I start at the top. And then I go down through my cycle. Down, top, middle, bottom, middle, top. Connect the dots just like that. That's number 2. Number 3, now we're going to get harder. 2 cosine x minus 1/2 pi. So amplitude is 2. Period length, start off with 2 pi and multiply by the reciprocal of whatever's in front of the x. There isn't anything, so it's just 2 pi. The vertical shift would be whatever's tagged on the end. There isn't one. The horizontal shift is whatever's added or subtracted inside of parentheses, so that minus 1/2 pi. Since it's minus, we do the opposite. It's really going to take me right pi over 2. Okay? Then we're going to graph. We do 4 hash marks. 1, 2, 3, 4. The 4th hash mark is whatever we had it labeled as, which was 2 pi. This is half of that. This is half of that. This is 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves. I would then graph my amplitude. My amplitude is 2. So I go up 2 to +2. That's the top. I go down 2 to -2. That's the bottom. It is a cosine graph. So normally, I would start my cosine graph at the top right here. But it's not going to go there because I shifted right pi over 2. So I'm going to take this dot and move it over to pi over 2. So it's going to be right there instead. That's my starting dot. Then it would go middle, and then bottom, and then middle. And I need one more to repeat the cycle, so I'd go one more line. I threw an extra hash mark up here. I don't have to label it. It's fine. It'd be right there. It would technically be 5 pi over 2. But you don't have to label it. Start at the top, middle, bottom, middle, top. There's my graph. Number 4, -3 sine 2x plus 2. Amplitude is -3, so it's 3, and since it's negative, it's flipped. Period length, you start off with 2 pi, and you multiply by the reciprocal of whatever's in front of your x. The 2's would cancel, leaving you with just pi. So the 4th line here would be pi. Cut that in half, half a pi. Cut that in half, pi over 4. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. Then I'm going to do vertical shift. We finally have a vertical shift. That +2 is me shifting up 2. Horizontal shift will be whatever's added or subtracted inside of parentheses. There isn't one. So when I graph, I start off with the vertical shift first. Since it's up 2, I'm going up 2 right here, making my line and labeling that as the midline. That's the new middle of my graph. 3 is my amplitude. So from here, I'm going up 3 to 5 and down 3. 1, 2, 3. Going down here to -1. That's the bottom of my graph. It is a sine curve, so sine curves start in the middle. So I'm going to put a dot right here, but it's flipped because of the negative sign. Instead of someone going there and up, I'm going to go there and down to the bottom, not to the black line, but to the bottom of my graph. And then to the middle again, and then to the top, and then back to the middle. There's my sine curve. 2 more. Number 5, we're graphing sine x plus pi over 2. Amplitude is 1 because there's nothing in front. Period length is 2 pi. And then you multiply by the reciprocal of whatever's in front of the x. There isn't anything, so it stays 2 pi. Vertical shift is whatever's tagged on the end. There isn't one, so there isn't one. And horizontal shift is whatever's added or subtracted inside the parentheses. Since it says plus pi over 2, that's really taking me left pi over 2. So I make my normal graph. I give me the 4 hash marks. The 4th hash mark is my period length, 2 pi. So this one's going to be 2 pi. This is pi. This is pi over 2. 3 pi over 2. Hopefully you're getting the hang of that. When I make my graph, next thing I would do is vertical shift. There isn't one, so I'm not going up or down. Then I do amplitude. Since my amplitude is 1, I go up to +1 and down to -1. That's the bottom. That's the top. Then I go to make my graph. It is a sine curve. So normally, with a sine curve, I would start my graph right here in the middle. But I've been shifted left pi over 2. So instead of putting my dot right here, I'm going left to pi. I made a new hash mark because 1 hash mark gets me to pi over 2. So I went left, and I'm going to call this negative pi over 2. There's my first dot. Then I just go. It's a sine curve. Don't forget 0. So once I'm there, my next one's going to be up here at the top at 0, then back in the middle at pi over 2, then at the bottom at pi, and back in the middle at 3 pi over 2. You could keep going, but I have enough dots. Now I'm just going to connect them. So I'm starting down, through. There's my graph right there. Last one. 4 cosine x plus pi minus 2. I'm making these graphs ahead of time, but you hopefully are understanding why. Amplitude is 4. Period length, we start with 2 pi and we multiply by the reciprocal of whatever's in front of my x, so I didn't change it at all. -2 is my vertical shift. Since I have a -2 right there, it's going to take me down 2. So that means my midline is going to be down 2. Horizontal shift is whatever's added or subtracted inside of the parentheses. So since it says plus pi right there, I'm going left pi. Let's make my graph. I did my 4 hash marks. The 4th one is 2 pi because my period length is 2 pi. Cut it in half, and count. 1 half, 2 halves, 3 halves. Next thing I always do is my midline. Since my midline is down 2, I'm going to go down to -2 and draw my line. That's the middle. My amplitude is 4. Since my amplitude is 4, picking a new color. Amplitude is 4. I'm going from that line, 1, 2, 3, 4, to the top at 2. And I'm going down from the midline, from that -2 line, down 1, 2, 3, 4, down here to -4. Or down, that's -6, sorry. Then we're graphing. It's a cosine graph. So normally a cosine graph, I would start right here at the top. But we said we are shifting left pi. So that dot right there is going to shift left 2 because it takes 2 hash marks to get to pi. This would be -pi over 2. This would be -pi. I start at the top. Then the next one would be in the middle, so on my red line. And then I'd be at the bottom. Then I'd be back to the middle, and then I'd be back to the top. There's my graph.